in Psalm chapter 10. Now, let me begin by saying if you're praying with the psalmist, uh, what is perhaps a little bit unsettling is that prayer puts you on the battlefield. The prayers are not called. The prayers are not for the pacifists because you have to deal with the things that we struggle in life. So this is a challenging psalm because most of the preaching or the teaching on the psalms usually don't go into this kind of disposition. But I want you to understand that some of the most calm and serene prayers don't really go too far. And so he's dealing with reality and he's dealing with some really unsettling emotions. He's in a stressful, violent kind of situation, not just for himself sometimes, but he's looking at the reality of the world here in Psalm chapter 10 and how unsettling and how the ungodly are so arrogant and proud, and they believe that they're invulnerable and they're not going to be held to account, and they do evil just because they can do evil, and underlying that, of course, is their evil. There's just no other way to explain it. And when I'm talking about unsettling, we have to keep in mind where the nation is today, because there's a lot of frustration about what's going on in the streets. So this psalm is really apropos, and we're going to look at Psalm chapter 10 for just a moment today, and we want to begin in verse number 1 because this is such an important verse. I think probably we have experienced this ourselves on a number of occasions. So Psalm chapter 10 and verse number 1, David asked, "Why should you stand so afar off?" God looks like he's withdrawn and that he's indifferent from the things that are going on, the evil things that are going on. And the writer is wondering, why do you seem to be so far away and so far off, and you hide yourself in the times of trouble? Now, interesting, of course, we probably had friends who were not friends and they didn't stand by us when you needed them. But what he's doing here is he's praying to God. And notice, I want you to think about what he's really saying in his prayer to God. I don't know if you ever said this to God or not, but saying, "God, where were you when I needed you? How come you didn't answer? We stood by the bedside and we held hands and we prayed and you didn't answer. And the sick died, and the people who've done evil have gotten away with it." And I think that that takes that to God in prayer. And what I'm trying to say is simply this: you can take that frustration to God. You got to be honest in prayer. You may go to the throne of God and bring out your discouragement and your disappointment, but you always do it in the right spirit. God understands that. If you've been depressed about something, if you've been discouraged over something, if you see evil going on and wicked people and people doing all kind of bad stuff, you can go to God and say, "God, I just don't understand why you're not doing something about it." And that's the feeling there. And in many different areas of life, I think we've come to that kind of conclusion sometimes. And one of the dangers is when you're going to God in prayer like that, is just don't you give up. Now notice he says that in verse number 2, that and let me just say something. It just came to my mind and I don't want to forget it. You got to remember something here, very important. God doesn't have to report to you. He doesn't have to answer to me. God doesn't have to report to humanity. God doesn't have to do that. And just keep that in mind. Just trust in him and things will ultimately turn out all right. Now watch verse number 2 here. Now what's going on in the psalm is David he looks around and how there's no justice. They oppress the poor. The wicked are arrogant. They speak ungodly things. God isn't in their life. In fact, he'll put it in a way there's no room whatsoever for them in their life. They seem to prosper. They seem to get away with it. They don't feel that they're accountable for what they do because they're in power and they can do it. Boy, doesn't that sound like the crisis we are in today in our own nation. Now, verse number 2 then. "The wicked in his pride pursues the poor." persecutes the poor, and he takes the devices that he's imagined. It's almost like he's just hunting down the poor. And he goes on to say in verse 3, and by the way, you'll see this all through the psalm here, that the wicked and the evildoers, they're filled with pride. They boast. They think they're above God. They don't think God even sees what they're doing. They don't care about God. God doesn't have nothing to do with what they're doing, they think. Now, notice again, verse number 3, for the wicked boast of his heart's desire. And notice here, the next phrase talks about his covetousness. He wants power, he wants greed. And in that, he persecutes and oppresses. And look, the Bible says in that last phrase, and God hates that. Boy, if that wouldn't slow us down sometimes. God hates those people that do those kind of things, hates those kind of violence, hates that kind of oppression. God's not indifferent. It may seem like he is, but he isn't. Now, verse 5. Now, what he's going to describe very quickly, and I'm going to run down this real fast today, but look, speaking of the evil, his ways are grievous. His judgment are far above his sight. Again, what we've been saying. As for all his enemies, he puffs up there again with that pride stuff. And then verse number 6, he said in his heart, I will not be moved. I can get away with it. Nobody's going to stop me. Verse number 7, look at his mouth, cursing and deceit in it, lying and slander. And oh, is there so much of that going on today? Verse number 8, notice he sits in lurking places. It's like he's hiding in the corner, some dark place, and some old innocent stranger comes along and he preys upon him and he murders the innocent. Look at that, even to the extent that people will kill and murder you. Now notice number 9, he lieth in secret like a lion, and he lies to catch the poor. Just think of that. And he does catch the poor, and he draws him into a net. He gets away with it, so it seems. Verse number 10, he crouches and humbles himself that the poor may fall to the strong ones. Verse 13, notice, verse 11 rather, and I'll slow this down because I want you to see what God has to say about this. He has said in his heart. Now remember, David's praying to God, and he says, those wicked people, those evil people, you know what they're saying, God? They're saying that God has forgotten and hid his face and he will never see it. God won't touch me. God won't do anything about it. He doesn't even know what I'm doing. And so in verse 11, now things begin to change a little bit in the latter part of this particular psalm. Arise, O Lord. I just want you to keep in mind as we're looking at the psalm that this is a prayer. I mean, David's praying for justice. He's praying that God will rise up in righteousness and deal with the enemies. And he says, God, lift up thine hand and strike them and forget not the humble. Now, verse 13, why does the wicked condemn God? Why does he say in his heart that God will not require it? That is, God will not hold me accountable, that I can do it and God's not going to do anything about it. Boy, that's a mistake, isn't it? Verse number 14, thou hast seen it. No, they don't think God knows what they're doing, but God knows exactly what they're doing. You can't hide from God. You can't do evil things and think that God doesn't know about it. The only reason sometimes people have gotten away with it, God's given a little bit of mercy to repent. But watch it here. Thou hast seen it, for thou beholdest mischief and spite, to requite it. God's going to require that of you. He's going to hold you accountable. You're going to have to give account for that. You're going to have to stand before the judgment of God for that. You just don't really ever get away with it. And then he says, and with the poor he committeth himself unto thee, for thou art the helper of the fatherless. Now that God is saying, I'm going to do that for them. If you put your trust in God and you rely on him, God is, whether he does it in this life or ultimately in the next life, God is going to take care of those situations. Verse 16 and following, this is where we're going to end today. And here's what he said, the Lord is the King forever and ever. We need to have that in our mind. It needs to be cemented in our our soul, that God is the king. He's sovereign. He rules over everything. He knows what's going on. And in this particular context, you see, God is telling the wicked, you know, I know what you're doing, and you aren't going to get away with it. Paul talks about some people's sins are hid before the judgment, and then some are open. Now, verse number 17. And the Lord has heard the desire of the humble. Thou wilt prepare his heart. Thou wilt cause his ear to hear. Verse number 18, to judge. See, God will judge. Judge the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man on earth that may no longer oppress. You know, ultimately, someday, those things are going to be true. Someday, you see, that when all this business is over, that we're going to live in righteousness before the King of the universe. And that's a wonderful thought. So what's happening in the psalm is David, he's not pretending that there isn't bad things happening to good people. And there are some bad things that happen to good people. You put that before God and in his throne of mercy. You leave it there. You let God take care of that. But I want to just give you the thought again. I want to stress this. At least I think it's something important in the Psalms. You can express your feelings, whether your anger or your frustration, to God. You keep that in reverence. I think that's what you're seeing in the Psalms. A lot of the emotion, how you really feel, and you can let God know how you really feel. You can take that to God, and that's where you process it. You take it to God, and then let the Lord take vengeance on the evildoers, and let God provide a way of escape for you. So that's the Psalm today, and I hope that's been helpful someone. And we'll be looking at the Psalms next week, Monday at 12 o'clock.